kind of starting at the ground level, Ben, how would you define secularization?
Well, that's a great question. So it can be defined in many different ways, and I almost want to pull back a little bit and refrain from defining it too clearly because it's a bit of an ambiguous term,
Okay.
and it's meant to be. And actually, some work is being done even right now on defining secular in different ways. It's sort of gone through multiple definitions through history, and so one thing that used to be looked at was the Hebrew sense of the word secular and the Greek sense of the word secular, and there was much to do about how one is a time-bound word and one is a more locative, place-bound word. And there's all these kind of semantic ways of going into it. But basically, if we were to boil it down to the way that we use the word secular in our modern age, we typically, when we use the word, we just think of the a-religious sphere of life. The only issue with using that definition is that it pits secularism as the non-religious. It makes it out to sound like secularism is what you get when you remove any sort of religious structure. And I would just say that's where a lot of work has been done to understand, is that really what the secular is? Secular belonged to a different category in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, when you said secular, it didn't have any derogatory association. If you said something was secular, you just meant it's just not parochial. It's not part of the church. So the baker, the butcher, the candlestick maker, whatever, they're all doing secular jobs, and a religious vocation is the work of the church. But these are just two different spheres. As we move on into the modern age and post-enlightenment, secular begins to look a little bit different. And what it evolves to basically is secular becomes an option among many in terms of I can choose to be religious or I can choose to be secular. And that's a definition given to us by Charles Taylor, who wrote A Secular Age back in 2007. So I know I'm giving you a lot of information. You asked for a simple
No, this
definition,
is awesome. I don't need a
but
simple one. This is great.
it's tough, yeah, because it's kind of tough to narrow it down. And all I would say is simply the way that we define it currently, we tend to use it culturally in our nomenclature to just simply mean the a-religious, that which is opposed to or different than the church. But it is a little bit more complicated than that. The word goes through a number of transitions through time and in historical epochs. So that's just a better way of approaching it, I suppose.
So as you work apologetically in these things, are you trying to redefine or are you trying to work with kind of current definitions?
I am trying to work with the current definition. I want to
Okay.
I want to understand. When I say I want to understand secularity, I want to understand a new post-Christian age. So I use secular as shorthand for discussing the way in which our societal fabric is now basically atheistic. And that's an exploration of something that Charles Taylor, again, I'm going to cite that work quite a lot because it is the foundational text. For people
Sure.
who are unfamiliar,
Well, I got
Charles Taylor.
questions related to Taylor coming up. So
Yeah, we could go
yeah,
into that. I mean,
yeah,
but it's important to say, and Taylor's been, well read over the years and critiqued, and there's much to say. But it remains kind of the landmark text for talking about this.
okay.
It's a historical genealogy expressing, how did secularism arise? We should probably even define secularism. Any ism is different than just simply secularity. That's one of the things he'd want to go into. But really what he's asking, if we were to boil it down to its most simple, basic elements, is how come 500 years ago, basically everyone was religious, and now the default is basically no one is? It's not to say that religion isn't present, but it more or less, there's a lot of religious nuns. They're Nones, right? There's a lot of people who just don't have a religious association. Well, 500 years ago, that's almost impossible. You all had a religious association. So what accounts for that change? And when my interest in secularity from a apologetic standpoint is really interested in that question. What amounted to that change? Why did that change take place? What were the historical shifts? And where does that situate us now as a culture? Because as an apologist, and as forget apologist, just as a Christian, as somebody who's given the duty of the divine mandate of the of the Great Commission to go and spread the gospel, you want to know who it is you're talking to. And you want to know what's the basic frame of reference that most people by default are living in. And it's different than the ancient world. It's different than the medieval world. We are a post-Enlightenment, post-Christian society. And all those definitions are actually really important for us to understand how to communicate with culture, mainly because, and I'll say this is central to Taylor's thesis, is that definition I gave just a moment ago that says, well, secular is just what you get when you remove all the religious trappings of the language. Charles Taylor is going to challenge that entirely. He's going to say, no, it's not a subtraction narrative. Secularity, in the way we understand it, is born out of the religious ethos. It is born out of Christian thought. So the only way you can be an atheist today is if you're a Christian atheist. That's really at the heart of this, is that we're post-Christian. We had to move through Christianity in order to get to where we are culturally today. So I know that's a lot, but that's kind of the framework that I'm working in and the questions that I'm asking.
No, that's fascinating. Do you think, I mean, this is maybe just conjecture, but that any of the, I don't know, new atheists, modern kind of popular atheists would recognize, like, is that a Taylor idea? Would they recognize that they have come out of
without sounding
yes,
without sounding too blunt, although I don't really mind when talking about the new atheists, I don't think the new atheists were sophisticated enough to understand that at all. So I don't think they're speaking from that place in the slightest. It's helpful to recognize, I mean, new atheism, and when we talk about that, we're talking about the who are the four horsemen they were when I was younger, right? Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins probably being the biggest, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. Those guys, all those voices of the new atheist movement, it's important to recognize they emerged almost directly after 9/11. That was a significant turning point in the cultural imagination when people were addressing religion in a much more intolerant manner, because there was religious extremism that was leading to terrorism attacks. And all of a sudden people were, I remember watching Bill Maher and people like that and going like, this is the mother lode of bad ideas. And they were talking about Islam, but then Christianity was wrapped into that. And it was this attack on the Christian faith. And really what they were trying to do is poke holes in the moral fabric of religious communities, Christian fundamentalism. But they weren't coming at it from some philosophical, deep understanding. They were basically just empirically viewing the world, looking at their experience, what was happening, and saying, religion is causing all kinds of rot. And this is not, so that's where Christopher Hitchens says, well, religion just poisons everything. And so that dialogue was popular for a moment, but it really was a fad. I mean, where is new atheism now? Christian, it's just, it hasn't gathered any steam. And that's because I don't think they were paying attention to the greater conversation that people like Taylor were really doing, and doing the hard work on. And that's why guys like me, who are theologians, we kind of looked at the new atheists and just kind of went, who even cares to respond to this? It's not philosophically sophisticated. It doesn't really understand the religious understanding of, it's attacking fundamentalism. And I wish that were a straw man. And unfortunately it's not, because there are many people who actually do have this quite naive, juvenile understanding of the faith that puts them in that position. So there's a debate to be had there. But no, the new atheists are talking about something completely different. Yeah.
Do you think some of the, I don't know, their undoing or them losing a popular voice has to do with something that some recognized early on, as I'm sure you yourself did, like that they were working in fields that were outside of their own expertise? And maybe that led to some of the unsophisticated responses to some Christian themes. And
well, that's a great question. I mean, and actually that very phenomenon of that happening, this idea of interdisciplinary approaches, that somehow a Richard Dawkins, who is a biologist, and maybe a very good one, I don't know a whole lot about his work, but the fact that he was able to step outside of that field and think that he could talk about the religious sphere or the theological, or make comments philosophically about these things, is actually indicative of the very things that secularism brought about, or vice versa. That a movement toward this idea of the expert as somebody who, oh, well, we should just look at Richard Dawkins as an authority because he's got a PhD in biology. Somehow he should be able to be an authority
Yeah.
on religious history is itself a sort of secular idea, like, or it emerges within a post-enlightenment period. That would never be the case before then. To this day, theology, I just think it's funny as a discipline. I mean, like no other profession do I know, or somebody just come up to you off the street with no understanding and be like, let me tell you what I think about God. You're like, yeah, as if I would go to Richard Dawkins and be like, I got a thing or two to say to you about chlorophyll, buddy.
Yeah.
Let me tell you what I think. I'm just some guy. But that's what theology invites, that,
Yeah. Yeah.
everybody and their dog has an opinion on it. And that doesn't mean they necessarily know what they're talking about, but we need to allow for them to have their opinion and that dialogue. So,
I
yeah.
wonder if Jordan Peterson is, kind of a modern replacement of them, but he is working for the most part. He's looking at Christianity now through the lens of his field of
Without a doubt.
study.
It's funny you bring him up. I think I'm actually somebody who has followed Peterson from the very beginning. Now, I'm not to say that I'm some like fan who watches everything he does. What I mean is I was very much on the pulse of it the moment he came into the limelight.
Okay.
So when his controversy was happening in 2016, I remember listening to an interview of him on CBC radio and going like, this guy's interesting. Like he was talking about the trans issue stuff and pronouns, but really I was going like, his vocabulary seems to be coming out of this religious place. Like, what's going on there? And I remember watching some of his lectures and videos before he ever emerged into the mainstream and thinking, this guy's about to be very popular. I could tell that was about to happen. And this is exactly right. What Peterson represents in our modern age is, in a sense, a return. And I think people were willing to look to Peterson rather than a lot of religious structures or the church or priests or whatever. They were looking to somebody who was standing in a skeptical place, somebody who Peterson never admitted that he was a Christian, so he felt a little safer because he didn't have these dogmatic, allegiances yet. And yet what he was doing was he was trying, in a sense, to get people to think back to a pre-modern age where the scientific realm is actually not the grand metaphysical scheme of things. The scientific understanding of the world is embedded within the larger mythological sense of our understanding and of truth. And that, once people were able to think about it that way again, all of a sudden, I think we saw this turn, this resurgence into the religious. We're seeing right now a bit of an awakening, I think. I think there's a bit of a religious turn. People are coming back to the church. Gen Z is like, the numbers have quadrupled. Part of the reason for that is because for too long we were following the secularist playbook. We were in this post-enlightenment phase of thinking everything is supposed to be scientific and empirical. And the truth is that's not the way the world operates. The Bible doesn't play by those rules. I mean, one of the reasons why atheism emerged is not because of its opposition with science, it's because of its embracing of science and using a language and a vocabulary that's not really its own, or not really its, not that it's not its own, but that it's not its grounding. It's not, we don't develop religious ideas out of an induction method of scientific experimentation. We don't do that. It's religion is, and the Christian religion in particular, comes out of something much, much different, much grander. To reinvigorate the language of mythology is actually a good thing. Myth doesn't just mean it's false. It means that there's layers of truth embedded into physical reality. I'm going to get way too abstract if I just carry on with that, but you can kind of see where somebody like Peterson marks this turn in our age, for good or for ill. I mean, say what you want about him. I'm just saying basically that the phenomenon that is Peterson has emerged because that language was largely forgotten by Christians. That we've been operating within this scientific paradigm for so long that we needed somebody, I think, to come back and remind us, like, no, it's a mythology. It's greater than that. It's not a ideology. It's a religious substructure. These are bigger ideas. That's a good way in. And of course, what's interesting is that a guy like Peterson is hardly new. He's
Mhm.
hardly novel. I mean, it's just people just don't read these people. But all that Peterson was really doing, especially initially, was regurgitating Carl Jung and Nietzsche and obscure names like Northrop Frye and others. Like that's all he was doing. And most people who were just unfamiliar with that way of thinking about it thought that this was some incredible. I mean, all of a sudden he was selling out stadiums talking about the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think for many theologians in the academy, we were like, yeah, we've been here the whole time, but no one really, no one was looking to us for those answers. So anyway, I just find that whole thing very
Yeah.
interesting. I don't know if I went down a rabbit hole
No,
there.
I could listen to
Yeah.
this all day, but I wonder too, like,
Yeah.
just kind of just a thought. I wonder if like Peterson's a bit of an embodiment of Taylor's ideas
Yes.
from a secular age.
It, very much so. I think, one of Taylor's main points is one of the concepts that he's introducing to us is this idea of disenchantment. So in a secular age, in the modern atheistic age, part of what accounts for that is because of movements within science and communication and technology and whatnot, we've largely gone from a medieval period in which everything was enchanted with sprites and fairies and spirits. I mean, I once heard a theologian say about Martin Luther in the 16th century. They said, like, if you walk home tonight in the evening after dark and you're not afraid about being possessed by a spirit, you do not inhabit the same world as Martin Luther. Like we have to recognize that that's the social imagination, another Taylor phrase, social imagination of people living in that era. And we operate in a completely, we are disenchanted. He talks about what's called the porous self and the buffered self. So in the medieval ages, the porous self is the self that, yeah, these external forces, spirits, like things can act on me without my knowing about it, and it can influence me and change, and I could have spells cast on me or something. Well, we're now buffered selves. We're individual, and what we do in our modern age is we think everything that we encounter, we can decide whether we want to absorb that or not. It kind of deflects off us. We're buffered. So we're now a disenchanted people. And that idea of disenchantment, this is exactly what Peterson represents, is that he's kind of at the end of all of this going, well, the world's far more enchanted than you think. Because and approaching it from a psychological perspective is a great way to kind of see that. Because the moment you go into a story like the ones in Genesis and say, stop looking at these as though they're forensic historical data purely, not to say that it isn't that, but to say like it's not only about that. These are explorations of the human psyche. Well, that reinvigorates for a lot of people, this new angle of looking at the Bible and Scripture that all of a sudden they can approach again. It was too narrow before that because we were allowing. This is my own idea, but I mean, like, but we were allowing the scientific milieu to define those categories for us. And I say that's my idea. It's, of course, not mine alone. But I mean, this has been the project of many theologians in the last 50 years. Look at something like radical orthodoxy, the movement spearheaded by John Milbank, if anyone's familiar with that. I mean, radical orthodoxy is this whole notion of like we need to reinvigorate, reinterpret, re-narrativize the Christian story and get it away from secular modernity's takeover. That our language has been handed over to them. Well, no, we're the queen of the sciences. We need to be the ones who establish how all these other disciplines are understood because we're theology. When the university was founded, it was theology, medicine, law. Right? We're the foundation. So some people might disagree with that. They might say that's too strong of a position, but there's a movement there, and that's what. So yeah, anyway, this is all the ways in which secularism has been combated and talked about, and it's part of a really large discussion about just where we are as a people, where our
Yeah.
frame of mind is, and the way we view the world, what we take for granted.
It's kind of a neat time to be here, like seeing this shift. Like
Oh
seeing
yeah,
the atheists, how afraid of them we were, and then like what's happening. Like a Ruslan, I think, was at a Apologetics Canada thing a little while ago, right? You're
sure,
familiar
yeah,
with.
yeah. He was. I
And
wasn't at that, unfortunately, but yeah,
okay,
he was. I wanted to meet him. Yeah,
I think he already, or it's coming up. I think he already had a conference now where like Alex, is it Alex O'Connor?
Alex O'Connor. Yeah,
I think it was like at his conference, which is
It was, yeah.
just so the Alex O'Connor just like he speaks with that skepticism, but like not in the way that a hitch like Dawkins was not going to show up at a conference
Totally.
or it would have been like crazy, but it wasn't crazy for O'Connor to be there. He's just like, yeah, it made sense a
100,
little. Like,
100%. And I appreciate somebody like Alex O'Connor because he's far more amicable. He's not like Christopher Hitchens was, and bombastic and combative and trying to basically just shut down religious whatever practice or something. Although some might argue that's not what Hitchens did either. But the point is, Alex O'Connor is far more friendly to it.
mhm,
In a way, he seems like somebody who's genuinely seeking and going like, look, I'm just not convinced yet, but I
mhm,
want to have this dialogue. But it's interesting to me, Alex O'Connor also represents the type of like the reason why he's the number one atheist in the world right now and the most popular. Look at the kinds of questions that he's asking. He is most interested in the historical reliability of the scriptures. Now, I think that's entirely appropriate. I think that's a very important thing. That's one of the reasons why my co-host and colleague Wes Huff is so popular right now, is because that's his area of expertise. People want to know the facts of the matter. They want to know, did this really happen?
mhm.
But I want to say those are largely modern questions. These are questions that come into prominence only recently in our history. For the grander portion of theological history, theologians weren't so concerned with trying to prove the historical veracity of any of these claims. They understood it as a theologized history embedded in a tradition and within a language that needs to be adopted and used within a community. I know that might not make sense to me, but the whole debate that's happening right now, the whole rise of apologetics in general, and Wes Huff and Alex O'Connor, like the reason why these figures are big right now is because they're interested in questions that modernity is interested in. Historical verifiability. I keep tripping over that word. We haven't always been there.
Yeah.
That's an evolution. There's a progress towards those questions, or it's baked into a sort of societal framework that these are our interests right now. That's something I'm always interested in doing as an apologist. We look at all these questions that are asked to us about like, well, explain this, that, and the other. And I'm almost more interested in the question itself and saying, were people always asking that question?
Yeah.
500 years ago, were they concerned with that question, or is it risen into prominence? And is there a reason for that? Even something like the problem of evil, which seems to come at apologists the most from a theological or moral standpoint, and people wrestling with how can God be good? Well, 1,000 years ago, I mean, it's not that it wasn't asked, but it wasn't highly prominent. It wasn't like the main thing people were concerned with. They understood their world very differently. And so I'm really interested in the cultural zeitgeist. Like where is the mind of modern man or woman, right?
This might be a crazy idea, but I wonder
Yeah.
if, like, in terms of us asking these questions now of the reliability of Scripture, like, is it? I think if
Yeah.
sometimes it's a distance thing, like almost like we're in a ship, and we're not concerned, we're not doubting that there's land as we're moving away from the land, and we can still see it. But all of a sudden, we get over kind of the crest, and we no longer see the land, and then people start going on board, like, is there land? Prove to me that
Yes.
there's land. Like we've gotten far
Yeah.
enough down the road that now we're like, yeah, but can I even trust these? Like 500 years ago, it was
Absolutely.
like, yeah, I can trust this. It
And
was only 500 years ago that it happened.
absolute and distrust. I mean, we are so. I mean, that's important. When I say we're modern people, we're living in modernity or post-modernity, however you want to define it. We're post-enlightenment people. I've used that language too. The Enlightenment is largely defined as an age of not just of reason, an age of suspicion is really what it is. And skepticism arises, and that's what René Descartes did. If he sort of marks the beginning of modernity, as many philosophers have said, 1650, the death of Descartes, Descartes is a doubter. It's not really I think, therefore I am. It's I doubt, therefore I am. And this provides the foundation for a lot of secular modernity. So we're skeptics. And therefore, you're right. I think we've moved over the crest, and a lot of us in today's world are kind of going like, well, I can't trust anything else that I'm being told by my government or by the internet or anything. How can I trust this? And so these are valid questions. We need the Wes Huffs of the world to help answer those questions. But what I also think is that for the more theologically astute, and I don't want that to sound like snobbish or something. I just mean, I'll say, just speak for myself. A guy like me, I'm past that. I don't need to talk about, like, I got to the narrative. I've done the work with Craig Evans of going and excavating Qumran and all that stuff. I've seen it. Now I just want to get on with theology.
Sure,
Like, you know what I mean? You kind of
yeah.
move beyond the skepticism and you go like, yeah, I'm not hung up on the discrepancies that you're talking about within the gospels. Like, I think they can be accounted for quite easily. I'm here to accept it. And I just want to move on with my faith. And I think for a long time, the religious worldview was exactly that. People for a long time just weren't really engaged in questions of historical verification. They were going, no, God is pretty obvious, and let's get on with what's he like.
Yeah.
That's a different question. And so, to me, I think as a theologian, I moved out of New Testament studies into theology for that reason. I was like, I'd rather just get on with it. Like, is that what's most important? I don't know. I'm not too interested in that debate anymore. And that's not to say that I don't think it's important that I should be had. I just mean personally, I just kind of go, I'm not that skeptical anymore.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen this one yet, but Jordan Peterson was on a podcast with George Janko.
Yeah, I saw some clips. Yeah,
Yeah,
thought that was cool.
like there was an interesting part where George really asks him like, "Are you a Christian?" And there's like the longest moment of silence, and then George kind of, you know, rephrases it for him, being like, I think Peterson asked him like, "What do you think?" And Janko's like, "I think you're a man who fears God and is
Mm,
wrestling with this, that, and the other." And then Peterson is like, "Yeah, that's exactly it," which was a beautiful moment just to see like, oh, he's not just like trying to
yeah.
conceal it and hide it. He's wrestling. I don't know that.
Mm.
I don't know. I really have a question here. I'm just thinking out loud. Like,
No,
I
I'm
feel like
glad you
people
brought it
don't
up.
give him enough grace that like he's
Agreed.
brilliant, but he's a human. He has skepticism. He's like wrestling. Everyone's always like, just tell us, like, are you all right? But he's in the process. I don't know.
Riley, I'm glad you brought that up actually, because I've been feeling exactly the same way. And this isn't like I don't really listen to a whole lot of Pearson anymore or anything like that. I was more interested in what he was doing early on, but I saw some of the clips from that. And I've noticed this lately. He did his Jubilee thing as well, where he, won.
Oh,
It was
right.
Jordan
Yeah, yeah.
Peterson against 20. He talks on George Janko about how upset he was about that because they were misled thinking it was a Christian versus atheists when it was really Jordan Peterson versus atheists. And I was Peterson is often accused of floundering on these questions. Oh, just come down on it like it's black or white.
Mhm.
And the truth is I've always respected what Jordan Peterson's been about there, that he's gone and he said it perfectly on George Janko. And it really made me think, and it was great, is that Janko pushed him a little bit on that idea of, look, is it really helping or is it hurting more to be so wishy-washy about, am I a Christian, am I not? Shouldn't you say that you are? And I think Janko gave him some good reasons. But then what Peterson said back to him was, he said, the question about belief, which no one takes that seriously, is, if I'm a Christian, that means, am I willing to go to the cross? Because that's what it means. And in that kind of summation there is so helpful, because what Peterson is doing is he's going like, your belief in Christianity is not just your affirmation of some proposition that floats up here that you're like, yeah, okay, I agree. It is, to believe is to walk in step with a whole host of challenges. I mean, to say, am I willing to put my life on the line to pick up my cross and follow Jesus? Because that's what it means to be a Christian. And so, can I really say that? And so I think there's a debate here to be said about, well, it's fine for me, even if I don't know that I would have the courage to go forward with that, to say,
Mhm.
yes, I am a Christian, because I do agree with the propositions. I agree with what's being proposed. I think there's evidence. I devote my life to it as best I can.
Yeah.
And that might be a place where I would disagree with somebody like Peterson, because I think Peterson, when he was on Jubilee, was asked that question, like, what makes somebody a Christian? And he kind of went into some definitions of people who live by this or that. To be honest, I think a Christian is anyone who claims to be. The question is, are you a good one or not?
Sure.
Right. But if you want to wear the name, if you want to say I'm a Christian, I'll take you at your word and say you're a Christian.
Yeah.
Now the question becomes, like, to what degree, are you, or do you mean that in the way that it can be fully explained? Will Jesus look at you one day and say, go away, I knew you not? Is that what's going to happen? Or so there are levels to it. But Peterson is right to challenge us to think a little bit more seriously about the fact that, like, when you say I believe in God, that's not just the end of a syllogism there. That's a deep existential question about what are you actually willing to do. And so I've always respected that. I would just say about Peterson, like, I defend him there. I
Yeah.
think he's been raked over the coals wrongly for not coming down on an answer. And what did he ask Janko at the end of that interview for? Janko said, "What can we pray for you for?" He said, "The courtesy of my convictions." And you could tell he was on the edge of tears, I think, when he said that, as he often is.
Yeah.
But yeah, like
Yeah. He just
I'm there
feels
for
the
him.
weight of that title in a way that some Christians don't. Right. He's like, I know what this is going to mean when
That's
I say
exactly
yes.
right. But I think unless we do take it that seriously, what are we really doing?
For
I
sure.
think, so I appreciate him taking it to that place.
In what ways do you see secular assumptions embedded in everyday life, even of Christian, even within the church?
Yeah, well, great question. I think one of the main things that immediately comes to mind is the fact that part of the secularist project is thinking that there's this neutral thing called reason. So when the Enlightenment happened and the Age of Reason happened, they attempted this, right? Society attempted this, particularly in the French Revolution of 1789, a very important cultural turning point where everything religious was overturned. They wanted to have a completely secular side. They even changed the calendar, right? It's like, we won't have any religious language. We're not going to talk about it this way anymore. Well, that ended in an abysmal failure. And it led to the executions of thousands by guillotine in the public square. It was it was absolutely a disaster. But it worked itself out on this idea that somehow, if we just follow reason, then everything will be okay. And I think to this day, most secularists propose this idea that, well, because religion has so much blood on its hands, and that's true, religion has done incredibly terrible and evil things. It's done a lot of good, it's done a lot of bad, it's a checkered history, yada, yada. That they say, well, we got to get rid of the religious and go back to reason and being human. And that'll lead us into this whether or not they think it's utopian, but they think it's a myth of progress. They definitely think things will get better if we just do away with certain religious practices or belief. And I think that's complete nonsense. And I think that's the main thing, that this idea that reason is somehow neutral and not contextual and not brought into it's been far more proven. And I think even science itself is beginning to prove this more as we study consciousness. It's not that facts don't care about your feelings. It's that your feelings don't really care about the facts. Typically, it's people's hearts that dictate something, and then their head rationalizes what their heart wants. That's really the understanding we have to come into. That's the reason why we have revelation in theology, where reason was always understood as the handmaiden to theology. Reason is important. Reason is not being undone, but it is being elevated by the revelation of Christ, who is the Logos in whom all things are made. That is foundational. And I think without that, I think the secularist is just naive to the point of blissful ignorance if they think that somehow everything is just going to be hunky-dory if we remove the religious ethos. It's, first of all, you can't do that because that's not what religion is, but I don't know where they're getting that. There's somehow this belief, like when I hear an atheist say something like, well, can't we all just be good people? And you kind of go like, where do you think that comes from? And this has been said so often it probably doesn't need repeating by me, but this argument needs to be put out there and made that how much the Christian religion has given the world in terms of its now presuppositional knowledge about the way human beings should be treated and the way we should behave. Our ethics and morals don't just, they're not just made up by humans out of their humanity. And that's not to say that humans don't have some moral code within them. Every religion wants to say they do. C.S. Lewis, his entire argument in Mere Christianity is in fact that human beings by nature do have a religious center, or a moral center, I should say. So that's not, I'm not saying you need the Christian faith in order to be a good person, but we do need the revelation of Jesus to put an end to our violence. That these are some assumptions that I think secularists make that I just go, I don't know where you're even getting that. It's historically completely inaccurate. Secularism has a huge trail of bodies behind it, and I'm not just trying to, this isn't a tit for tat about like, well, we have less bodies than you do, but the way that these ideas are brought into the world and codified, I just think sometimes it's taken for granted and people don't realize how much Christianity has actually given.
In a way, though, atheism should have more bodies. Like I
Yeah,
remember reading, I can't remember who I read, but a few years ago, a pretty staunch atheist being like, kind of asking the question, like, why is the U.S. not the dominant force in the world? We have the power to just
yeah,
stomp out every country. But he's like, but
exactly.
Judeo-Christian ethics have
Yeah,
weakened us. And he
yeah,
wasn't making an argument for it. He was just trying to point out to his fellow atheists, being like, you're being ridiculous. Like, if you think we're so atheist, then why are we not just crushing everyone?
totally. And I mean, that was a challenge to the new atheists. And that, to me, as an apologist, it's funny. I say an apologist, like I work with an apologetics organization. Am I an apologist? I try my best. But instead of, if I encounter an atheist, for instance, and I encounter many who challenge, Christianity's this, that, or the other, or I don't believe this or whatever, and they say atheism is what makes the most sense. Rarely am I trying then in the conversation to convert them. I mean, I might be in some roundabout way, but the truth is, I find it's better almost to say, okay, have the courtesy of your convictions. Why don't you look to some of the heroes of atheism and try actually acting like one? Like, look to Friedrich Nietzsche.
Sure.
And because, like, isn't he the one who understands this the best? Isn't he maybe the most popular atheist in history, the smartest one? Like, isn't he the guy? Go be more like him. Have the courtesy of your conviction and see where that gets you. Because he was somebody who understood. I mean, Nietzsche is such an ally in one sense to the Christian faith when you really understand him, because he recognized that without God there is no meaning, right? And he knew that. And he was just, you could say he was brave enough to embrace that truth for himself. I think he was obviously very, he misunderstood that. But I think he was right. He knew what he knew what the gamble was. He
Hmm.
knew what the risk was, and he was willing to go down that path. And he also understood atheism as a post-Christian atheism. He understood atheism as emerging out of the religious era, and therefore he said power becomes everything, right? And dominance and will to power, and that's the kind of courage we need, and we should be the Ubermensch. And that's just the natural. He was just smart enough, I think, as a philosopher to know that that's where this naturally leads. So I try and push atheists kind of further into that to go, well, think about this. And if you ground it out, understand that this is going to move to nihilism. That's kind of where it ends
Yeah.
logically.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you'd escape from that. You can pretend like it doesn't, but that's another reason why secularism, or as we understand it, is something that needs to be understood as an outgrowth of the Christian faith, not something in a sense even opposed to it. It's think about all the reasons why atheists are atheists. It's typically because they have some deeply held moral conviction that's often given to them by the Christian world.
Sure.
So anyway, I just find that almost an irony of the whole thing.
Yeah. No, I think you use the word pretending. be like, I've thought
Yeah.
that before about atheists. Like there's some level of pretending or like intentional naivety going on here.
Yeah.
It was a well-known guy, but I forget his name now, but out of Harvard that had said years ago, like, if we're going to take this to its full measure, then a pig has more inherent value
Right.
than a Down syndrome child.
Right.
But
Right.
nobody
Yep.
wants to go that far. But I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly. And
logically.
I don't think they can logic. You find they reach a logical impasse.
Mhm.
They can't kind of get over certain questions of those. I find most atheists fall back on a certain, what they think to be a certain common sense. And I'm glad that we now, after 2,000 years of Christian thought in the West, do have a bit of common sense when it comes to human decency and the way to treat other people.
Mhm.
But that's where I also say, like, what does the Bible say then, right? Don't forget the Lord your God in your prosperity. And I'm sort of paraphrasing Deuteronomy there, but that's kind of what God's saying is he's like, once I establish the law and once you kind of start obeying me, then things start to go well. And that's when you start to think that you don't really need me. And then you fall back into your old devices and your old plans. And I think that's what we've seen through history is like, yeah, human beings do have a moral center. It's imbued in us by it's God given. We're made in the image of God. You have a sort of lean toward the good, the true, the beautiful, sure, but left to its own, without revelation, without the religious structures that help guide that, that altruism turns into evil very quickly. It turns into a tribalism. It turns into a violence against anyone who's not within my camp, and Christianity has been guilty of doing that very same thing through its you know, mutations through the state, through all kinds of things. But by and large, the logic of Christianity, as we boil it down and look at it, doesn't account for any kind of tribalism. There's a whole reason why what is the Christian faith predicated upon but the grafting in of the Gentiles, right? The bringing in of neighboring tribe, of looking at the other and saying, you are no longer other. We are all strangers in a foreign land. Come be brothers and sisters. That's the logic. And so, yeah, I guess I just think I have little patience, actually, in some sense, for most people who talk like atheism is a common sense position. I go, okay,
Yeah.
well, sure it is.
And that's where like
Yeah,
the Alex O'Connors and the Petersons are like making more sense to me
yeah,
logically
for sure,
in
for
terms of
sure.
their skepticism and stuff. Can you think of a role that like, or I guess what role has technology, if it has, or digital media played in accelerating or reinforcing secularization?
Ooh, yeah, it's a great question. Well, and in a way, um, this can kind of go back to that earlier definition of just certain things about a definition of secular as not necessarily a derogatory thing, but just
Yeah.
secular as in a purely neutral standpoint in the world, like a place where the religious just doesn't invade. There was a book written in the 60s by a guy named Harvey Cox called The Secular City. It was one of the most, he was a Harvard guy, and it was in the stream of liberal theology, one of the most important or most popular, certainly, works of theology written. And he was sort of arguing for secularization in the sense of as we advance technologically, as we advance into certain types of society, and again, the word "advance" could be challenged, but as we move into a modern age, there are many things that secularity brings that we just want to be neutral, and in a
Mhm.
way, technology is another advancement of that. Sorry, maybe I should stop that train of thought because I realize I'm about to embark on something that I don't want to double down on too much
Yeah.
in speaking about. But maybe just to say that the technological advancements allow for uh, a, a lot more cross communication between cultures and sects. Now, you might be able to say that people get into their own echo chambers more, and it leads to a certain tribalism in that regard. But largely, it's opened up communication in such a way that that ideas between the religious and the secular divide begin to sort of meld together and flow, and so that more people are invited into a certain conversation that they otherwise wouldn't be having. I'm sorry, that answer might have been, I
No,
might have
that's good.
lost my train.
No,
Yeah, I hope that's okay. I feel
for
like that
sure.
was maybe a little bit abstract, but you got me thinking about a couple of things. Because when we say technology, you can mean all kinds of things. You could talk
For
about
sure.
AI
Yep.
and you can talk about all the, and it's created a lot of misinformation. I think I don't want to sound too pessimistic, I guess, is part of the thing that
Yeah.
I'm reaching for here is that I think technology can help us. It has to be directed. It has to be used properly and harnessed properly, but it's here to stay. And so there needs to be, I work at Acadia Divinity College, for instance, where we're really big on future studies and what does the world of AI look like and integrating AI into our classrooms in ways that are helpful. We don't want to deny it as a technology. We don't think that the way forward is just to be Luddite and live under a
Mhm.
rock. We have to integrate this kind of stuff, and there's important ways to do it. Um, it's going to come with a lot of pros and it's going to come with a lot of cons. And that's where I want to sound more optimistic about it. But at the same time, one of the things that I see happening is that it creates a different form of dialogue in which the people we look to for authority, we start to dictate who we want those people to be.
Okay.
We don't need to challenge ourselves as much. I think it's one of the reasons why you saw like this last presidential election, they called the podcast presidency. They were going, it was people like Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn who were dictating more how voters
Yeah.
came out and voted than were philosophers, politicians, etc. Whether that's a good thing or not, I think those are some of the changes that have happened with the technological advancements we've seen. And that's
Yeah,
going to
that's a good
change
point.
religious discourse in a huge way. I think there's a major question right now. Douglas Murray was on Joe Rogan, and this became like a huge thing. There's a huge question right now about expertise itself. Who do we listen to? Do you listen to me because I have a PhD, or am I just out to lunch talking about crazy ideas? Can I not listen to the comedian who seems insightful and is rhetorically persuasive? Does he not have a voice? Technology is advancing that conversation in a much bigger way. We have access now to hear from anybody. And will that mean that the better idea triumphs, or will it mean that more charisma and rhetoric triumph? And that's a danger, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just one avenue to go down. But I mean, that's something I'd be quite interested in.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see how it plays out. Like whether
Yeah.
I don't know in real layman's terms whether this makes us dumber or
Yeah.
better off.
Well,
But a decade ago when the presidency was coming, I would have been like, what does Noam Chomsky think?
yeah,
And
exactly.
now, I mean, this year, yeah, like you say, I was like, president's on Rogan. What was he? What did Rogan
You
say?
know, I'll say years ago in 20, I think it was like 2020, 2021, there was an article that came out in the magazine National Affairs, and I still cite it as one of the most important articles I've ever read, and it was called The Erosion of Deep Literacy. You can look it up. I think it's written by a guy named Garfinkel, hard name to
In what
forget.
paper?
National Affairs.
Okay.
Yeah, which I don't know much about the publication. I just remember reading this. And I thought this was bang on because what he was saying about technological advancement was what we are doing is we are eradicating what he called deep literacy. And this is a huge problem in theology. I think it's the problem facing our society. Because what it is what he's saying is as you get to AI and chat GPT, and even before when that article was written, it was really just iPhones in your pocket and
Hmm.
Google and these technologies work as, in a sense, supplementary brains. Like it's like you have another brain in your pocket. And what that means is that you are no longer engaged in the sort of rigorous process of taking data and information and converting it to knowledge and then wisdom. And technology is taking that ability from us away. And so the reason why it's the greatest problem facing us is because look at if you were to name, like if you were to ask somebody on the street, like, what do you think the biggest problems facing us today? They might say very specifically, they would say things like, well, climate change, or geez, the war in the Middle East, or nuclear war, or something. You can name any specific. What's connecting all of those is that at the heart of it is just simply our ability to solve problems. How can we solve any individual problem if we don't know how to engage the problem deeply enough to see the complexity of it to get to its heart? And what that article was saying is the greatest problem we face is the erosion of our ability to problem solve at all. And that's happening with the advancement of technology. And we need to be very careful. ChatGPT, AI, Google searches, okay, all of that stuff can be used as a tool. But the moment it starts taking over our thinking for us, we're doomed.
Sure.
And that to me is so I don't want to be a technological pessimist. In many ways, I think we've at a point where technology is also going to be the thing that helps us advance
Hmm.
and help solve problems. But we need to be, I think, careful about our own learning, what it's going to do to our brains. And this is why, this is why I think in theology, it's changing the conversation in a way that a lot of the people who seem to be leading popular conversations on theology, most theologians certainly would look at and go like, this isn't a very deep conversation. This isn't cutting edge stuff. This isn't, and it's leading the charge because it's dictated to us by the masses, no
Yeah.
longer by the experts. So, that could go either way, but those are a couple of the issues that I see.
Well, it's somewhat related to this. Here's my fear for people like Wes Huff, and you actually know
Yeah,
him. But just,
yeah,
I feel like to some degree, sometimes the best scholarship being done is
yeah.
by the guys that are not in the public sphere. Uh,
That goes without saying,
okay.
without a
Just
doubt.
because their time is solely, I mean, I've invited some, like, who is the guy? He wrote a book. Maybe it's here. Oh, I can't see it right now. I don't know. An amazing story. Oh, To Change the World, Hunter. Last name
Okay.
Hunter. Anyways, a
Yeah.
brilliant scholar. In a book I've loved. I asked him if he'd come on. He was like, "Sorry, I spend 12 hours a day in the study. I'm working 6 days a week, and to be honest, I appreciate that people like you are doing this because I don't like to speak. I don't like these interactions." I was just like, "Oh,
Totally.
that's we need that guy." It's just
Well,
like
and not
almost
everyone's cut out for it.
antisocial in his cave writing prolifically.
100%. And I mean, and yeah, to find both is going to be tough. There are a few, but the truth is, and look, that's why we need the Wes Huffs of the world too. I
Yeah,
want to say, I mean, Wes is a phenomenal communicator,
for sure.
and is able to take like we got to have the people in society who are going to go read Syriac so I don't have to.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah,
And he's one of those guys, and he's able to then translate it and bring it down for practical use by the masses. That's really helpful. But people should not mistake that and the information that he's giving. They shouldn't mistake it with them then having their own PhD and really knowing the like intricate depths of the
yep,
field itself that you can then advance and take over. And so to have somebody that immensely smart, studious, erudite to then be in the public sphere in any sort of popular way is
yeah.
going to be very difficult. It'll almost never happen because they won't interest people. But I mean, there are big names. Like for instance, I think of somebody like David Bentley Hart. Do you know that name?
No, haven't heard of that one.
He's Eastern Orthodox guy and a bit of a controversialist in the
Okay,
sense that he's into some ideas that some people in the evangelical world might not find appealing. But truthfully, no matter how you slice it, whatever you think of his ideas, I think few would doubt that he's a genius. He's an absolute genius. Because of his rhetoric and the way that he carries himself, he's managed to become a little popular. But he's still only popular in small kind of niche circles. He would never get the kind of notoriety that a Wes Huff would get
okay,
because his language is not accessible in the same way.
yeah, yep,
So you're not going to get him necessarily dictating the conversation. But if enough, this kind of stuff has a trickle down effect, right? I mean, we talk in history of things like certain terms. I mentioned Descartes earlier, for instance. Well, how many people listening to this podcast have actually read Descartes?
for sure.
Almost none. But
Yeah,
that doesn't mean that Descartes isn't an absolutely pivotal figure because those who did read him then disseminated that information into the wider, it got into the water, right? And it made it, we talk about the Kantian turn. Again, how many people understand Kantian philosophy? Maybe not many, but those ideas were enough for certain individuals to get a hold of, and it changed the cultural atmosphere,
mhm,
right? I mean, it can shift things. So everyone has their place, is all
for
I'd
sure.
say. We
I
need those
When I say a
bookwormish.
fear for Wes, I should maybe it's more like a prayer. I just mean that like I'm sure he's pulled in 1,000 directions now,
He
and the
is, yeah.
world has the has the ability to, if people like that don't have a lot of boundaries, to take him out of the study to where the content gets, and he doesn't
Yeah,
seem like a guy that would ever happen to, but can you see what I mean? That like you're
totally.
doing this good work, and like even I don't know, Peterson could be, but he's not. But like you're doing all this work in your study, and then you give a little to the public, and they eat it up. But then now, the more time you give them, the less time continuing the research. Kind of in the same way that like musicians,
Yeah.
first album's awesome, and then a few albums in, every song is about being on the road because they're
Yeah.
no longer
Yeah,
living the life that led to the music. Does that make
for
sense?
sure.
I don't
Yeah,
mean this at all.
absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
I'm benefiting every day from Wes. I don't mean this like
Yeah.
in a bad way. Just
No,
like,
I hear you. I think it's part of the reality, and he understands that, and where he's gone, and he has such a great humility about himself in terms of, I love at the very end of every single one of his videos, he always has that quote from, I can't remember the theologian, but just says, preach the gospel, die and be forgotten. Like, this isn't
yeah,
about, this doesn't need to carry on in some way. He doesn't care about his celebrity or something like
yep,
that. This is about just getting information out there and speaking truth, and we'll see where it goes.
yeah,
We hope for the best, but and Apologetics Canada continues. I mean, we're filming more of these documentaries on Can I Trust the Bible and trying to equip people with resources and stuff. And you do the best that you can. You just kind of put it out there, and I just think it begins for most people is with humility, with kind of looking at
yeah.
things. There's a phenomenon in psychology called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Have you ever heard of that?
No,
It's a
I don't think so.
If you had a graph and you had, say, X, Y here, and it would be the level of confidence you have in an area, and then your actual level of expertise. And basically, it does this. So what it's saying is Dunning-Kruger effect, discovered by Dunning and Kruger, is this idea that people are quite confident in themselves when they know very little about a topic.
Yeah, yeah,
And then what happens is, so like I'll take myself as a great example. I was a preacher's kid. I thought I knew theology. I was like, I know the Bible. I know the Bible inside and out. Then I went to graduate school and realized, oh, I know nothing. I know less than nothing. All of a sudden, my confidence plummets. And as I gain more experience, I start to come up in confidence again. As I
yep,
got my PhD, I was like, okay, maybe I know a few things. But you have to have that awakening of, and I just think we live in a society and a culture where the Dunning-Kruger effect is it's deepening,
yeah,
where people are speaking with such confidence about things they know nothing about. And that's not to just trash them or to say, right, like your opinion matters, but we really do need to start from a place of humility. Like, and Peterson, I'll go back to him. He
mm,
was excellent on this for a long time early on. I agreed with him totally. He was going like, here you are in a university protesting like we should reinvent capitalist society, and you can't even make your bed. Like, there's a level of priority here. Try and sort out some of the things in your own life before you confidently walk in and challenge things that have been established hundreds of years before you were around.
yeah,
I just think we need to begin from a place of like understand what you know. I mean, I here I am. I'm talking a lot about secularity and stuff like that. I don't know. I'm in a conversation with a
for
lot of
sure.
people. I look to the Charles Taylors of the world. I humble myself before them, as best I can, and hopefully I've learned some things along the way. But pride goes before the fall. And
Hmm.
I think the more we think we really know what we're talking about and don't take seriously the problem that's really in front of us, how complex things are, how complex humanity is, then we're gonna burn out, or
Yeah,
we're gonna fail miserably if we don't. And that's, geez, isn't that where the gospel really comes in? Is just relying on that and saying like, Jesus is the guy. I'm not the guy, right?
mhm,
I rely on him. I walk humbly with my Lord. Um, and then you're carried forward. I mean, that's the best we can do. That's
yeah.
what I'd say.
I guess this is Dunning-Kruger, but I always find, as a pastor, find that exactly that the kind of the staunchest heels dug in people in my congregation are usually the ones that have a little bit of, like, they're often new believers, like have a little bit of knowledge of something,
Right.
and then it's just like, and they're unmovable. And then I have conversations with
Absolutely.
scholars, and I feel they know the most, can unpack it the most, but they have the most hospitality to other
Yeah,
perspectives because they
for sure.
understand maybe the journey to get there. And along that journey, they've seen other credible people, making the same journey and landing in different
Totally.
camps. Yeah,
I think that's absolutely true. I'll even say we were talking earlier about Craig Evans, a New Testament professor who brought us both to school at one point. And Craig was great about that. I remember Craig was kind of the person. I remember you'd ask him questions about theology, and he'd be like, "I don't know. It's not my area. It's just
that's
not my
awesome.
area. Like I'm not
Yeah.
answering that question. Like you want to talk to me about the historical Jesus, I can go there, but didn't want to go out of his lane too much." And yeah, we'd benefit, I think, a little bit from that kind of humility of just stepping back and kind of speaking to what we know, but being careful about it. And
Yeah.
yeah, there's that famous quote too. This kind of goes to the secular point, what I think a lot of atheism is, and what they experience is, if you the quote is that if you take a sip from the philosopher's glass, you're an atheist, but God is waiting for you at the bottom. Have you ever heard
Oh,
that?
that's good.
It's
No.
but it's I think that's very true. I think there's this idea that at its heart, the Christian message is a very simple one, and it can be taken naively. And there can be people with, there can be very simple-minded people taking religion as, and I don't mean like there's one thing to have a childlike faith. I think everyone should have that. That's
Yeah.
great. I'm talking about treating the Christian faith in a fundamentalist terms of like, well, it's just this, and not really knowing what you're talking about. And then the atheist is somebody who looks at that and goes, this isn't right. And they rightly, I think, challenge that. And they take a sip of philosophy and they go, geez, I don't need any of this. But the truth is that if you take philosophy all the way down, you're going to end up back in the Christian faith. You'll end up back there at a different place, at a much deeper place. But, that's just how I've always seen it. I've seen it from my own experience. It's like you will meet really all those atheists we mentioned earlier, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, man, they're smart guys. But the smartest guys I've met are Christians. Like David Bentley Hart is way smarter than those guys, and he's Orthodox. So that's how I look at it. And
Yeah.
I just think be sure to follow it all the way down. You
It's a
know?
really good thought, especially when I feel like parents were, often afraid of your kid in the church, your kid going into
Yeah.
philosophy. But
Yeah.
maybe it's about
You know what? You're
going the
right.
full way. Like think of Anthony Fleur's last book being like, it was
Yes.
something like, I believe there's a guy, he was a theist to some degree. They had
I
to
agree
base.
totally with you because I'll just say my own experience in my early 20s. I walked away from the faith for a little while. I was tired of asking questions. I didn't know how to respond to the new atheists. I was feeling burned out, and I felt like I knew better, and so I walked into kind of an agnosticism and into more philosophy. And I remember my dad, who's an Anglican priest. Okay, I'm a preacher's kid. He didn't really, it wasn't a major concern to him. He kind of went, as a matter of fact, I remember his language was like, I said, like, I don't know if I believe anymore. And he went like, well, that's your problem. Like it's a problem, but it's your problem.
Yeah.
But the point was he was going, if anything, and this is where I tell people, a lot of people who I meet in churches and they're worried about their teenagers walking away from the faith. And I go like, why do they walk away? Like they're in their 20s, they're in college, they're walking away from their faith because they don't think it makes sense. If anything, I think for some of them, that's actually progress. That's actually a movement in the right direction. Sometimes when we're climbing a mountain, we have to walk further away from the end point in order to
Sure.
get there.
Yeah.
And it's not kind of the same thing. I think sometimes rather than reacting to that and going like, oh, they're falling away, say, dive in then deeper. Go
Yeah.
question it all the way. Go really read the flood. Don't just leave it at, I've asked a couple of questions, I couldn't get them answered, I'm now an agnostic. Dive all the way in. And if you go the full nine, I think we can be confident as Christians. I know I feel this way. We can be confident. If it's true all the way down. Christianity is true on every facet and every level. They will find their way back if they're seeking. So what you got to encourage them to do is to seek, not to just come back over to the team.
Yeah.
Go deeper, read your philosophy, go read the atheists, go see if they're convincing, but measure it against the other opinions. If you're going to go read Richard Dawkins's The God Delusion, go read David Bentley Hart's The Atheist Delusion. Read them both. Make sure you're actually looking into this. And I think if you just promote truth and questioning and allowing people to run that course, I think they all come back to faith. I mean, that's how it happened for me. And to me, it's ironclad at this point in my
Yeah.
understanding, but that's just my understanding. So,
I oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
uh, I just mean, don't fear it. I just would
Yep.
say, don't fear it. And I know a lot of parents who fear it, and I go like, don't worry. If they're asking questions, that's good. Encourage their question asking. Don't just shut it down and say they're losing their way. You
This
know?
is a worse analogy than your mountain one, but I was just thinking
Sure.
like, before in those 20s, when we jump in, I don't know, to faith or just exploration of what we believe, you jump into the deep end, you have to go down and under the water before you come back up.
Yes. Yeah.
You jump in and you're like, he's underwater. Yeah, but he's gotta go there in
Absolutely.
order to
And
resurface.
with that
This is part
analogy,
of the
right?
deep end.
You got to stay deep. You can't just come up right away.
Sure.
Right. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
other thing. You get the bend. So there's a sense too. It's like, sit in that for a minute.
Yeah.
Sit in it. I largely think for myself, I was convinced of the Christian faith, not because Christianity was just so compelling. I mean, it was later on when I put a foot into it,
Yep.
but I was convinced by the dearth of and the lack of answers that atheism gave. Atheism was so empty. You're like, this philosophy doesn't allow for anything. There's no, and it leads to empty places. And so, you let somebody sit there for a moment, they'll come back.
My wife did her undergrad was philosophy, uh, and she came out of like a culturally Catholic home. She went into philosophy and found exactly what you were saying. Like she found it to be empty, and she actually
Mm,
got a Bible assigned to her in like a humanities class, and never
cool.
even in her mind, never even knowing or hearing the name Jesus, even in all her catechesis, whatever, in Catholic
Mm.
kind of school. She read the Bible in her room, became a Christian alone in her room, knowing no
Wow.
other Christians. And then the trajectory of that was crazy because what do you do as a Christian when you have no history of knowing any Christians or what they, so in her mind, she read it and was like, I guess I'd go to the mission field. So she went from there just to like,
Yeah,
which is
that's
a good
super
challenge
cool.
to Christians because we have so many other influences that we're like if you just read the Bible, what would that kind of compel you to
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of like a
that's super
Peterson
true.
being like, this is what being a Christian means or whatever.
Yeah, and I
But
think, for many, I think that would help that, if people sometimes if we're raised in the church, we have these trappings, the dogma that surrounds, we're given doctrine before we've really been given the narrative.
mm,
And so then we think we need to fit everything into a doctrine we've already received. And obviously that changes depending on the church you're in.
yeah,
I've talked to some people. I did a lecture last year at the what was it called? The Atlantic Theological Society put it on, and another Orthodox guy named John Bear, who does amazing work with patristic scholarship stuff. John Bear was there, and I talked with him about his faith. He just had he's a very interesting theologian. And he said one of the great benefits he had was that he never studied theology. And he said what happened was he studied the classics. You see, he studied classical literature, ancient mythology, Neoplatonism, all that kind of stuff. And then he read the early church fathers. And so he never had doctrinal
that's interesting.
things hovering over him that he had to agree with. He just could
Yeah,
kind of come into this on his own. And it's just an incredible, like now when you hear him talk, you go like, this is refreshing. This
yeah.
is different. And that's not to say, I mean, I believe that for the most part, the doctrines that we hold to are important to hold to. So don't hear that. But, getting away from the frame, like if you were able to just pick up a Bible as though you'd never heard anything before and just read it for yourself, what
Mhm.
you'd walk away with, I imagine it'd be radically different.
And that I think that's Peterson again a little, and maybe
You
his
know, a little bit.
hesitation to claim the title of Christian because he's allowed almost he has a license to think about things and wrestle with them in a way that's kind of outside of the I don't know the pressures, the framework, whatever of Christianity that
So
will
true.
appear as soon as he makes that claim.
I agree, and I admire that. I mean, I am somebody who did the same thing. I mean, there's a reason why when I went to school, I wanted to be an academic more than I wanted to just be a pastor.
Sure.
Mainly because that's a calling thing too. But I mean, I think I wanted to put everything on the table. I
Hmm.
wanted to ask every question. I wanted to kind of be a skeptic for a minute. I wanted to respect the tradition as well and say, like, okay, if somebody's telling me that if all the church agrees that the doctrine of the Trinity is important, I should probably figure out why. But I want to explore it for myself from a neutral, in as much as it could be, a neutral standpoint. And I wanted to put everything out there. And I think that's the great attraction of being in theology is that you're not doing your work out of some camp. It's not like I'm a Wesleyan or a Baptist and then I do theology just to affirm what Baptists already think. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The purpose of this is to say, okay, is it correct? Can we stretch the boundaries? And I'll say I teach classes on heresy and orthodoxy and what is heresy in the ancient church. We always think of heresy as something as like you point the finger at someone and tell them they're a heretic. The point of talking about heresy, which comes from the idea of a wrong choice, wrong decision, that which goes against the grain, the whole reason that's established is to actually think about, well, how much elbow room do we have? It's actually about how much free play can we have
Oh, that's a
and
good way
still
to.
maintain unity. And that's the beautiful thing about it. Heresy just means you've finally gone over where you can no longer freely play.
Okay.
You've transgressed the rules in such a way that we're no longer in the same sandbox. But the purpose is to say within these boundaries, you're free to do whatever you want. You got all this play, like there's room for creative expression. There's room for exploration. It's not rigid and dogmatic. Dogma or orthodoxy, right? Go to like somebody like G.K. Chesterton. There's nothing more exhilarating than orthodoxy. That's where all creativity happens, is within the limitation. That's where there's creativity. So I just see theology that way as a way of going like, actually, this is about free play. This is about being an artist. This is about expression and doing interesting things. God is an artist.
Oh,
Let's
that's a great way
let's
of thinking
mimic
about
that.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Last question for you, Ben. What gives you hope today in the midst of what feels like an increasingly disenchanted secular world?
Mm. Okay, well, let me just go. I'm just going to go right to the playbook. The thing that gives me hope is Jesus Christ,
Okay.
and His living presence and reality in the Holy Spirit, and it's as simple as that. When you have faith in Jesus, there's no reason to despair in any of this. Um, Society is going to move through different phases and it will always be nonlinear. I believe that. I don't think that we're not actually as a whole always progressing toward some end or declining towards some end. We get better in some areas, we get worse in some areas. We build, things get torn down. That's the pattern. We are in the in between. We are in the age of the already and the not yet. Christ has come. Christ will come again. And so, because I put my faith in Jesus, I don't worry for 1 minute about the erosion of Christianity. We might end up a remnant for a time, and we might end up a mighty kingdom. I don't really care about the numbers. I'm here to be faithful and obedient to it. And so I put my hope in Jesus. And because I put my hope in Him, I don't think defeat is possible. And so I'm in no way, I might look at it differently in the sense that it doesn't make me some grand optimist about it's always going to be better from here. Not at all. I think, we still have to suffer here. But as Paul says in Romans 8, I wouldn't compare our sufferings now to the glory that we're going to have later on. And so yeah, I think we can be relaxed. I think we can just live out our faith and worship and love God and love people, as Apologetics Canada likes to say. And when your hope's there, you can chill right out. It's a
Amen.
good place to be. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the chat, man. It's been a pleasure to meet you and
Hey,
to get
this
to
was
pick your
great.
brain on some of these things.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry if I went off in a number of directions, but yeah, it was great to meet you. Hopefully, I'll get to meet you in person sometime, and happy to be here.